Today, we'll hear from three speakers as a part of this session. Stephen Sandage serves as the Albert and Jesse Danielson Professor of Psychology of Religion and Theology at Boston University, as well as the Research Director and Staff Psychologist at the Danielson Institute. Reverend Kristen Hydinger is a full-time researcher at the Danielson Institute, where she integrates sociology and theology degrees while representing BU remotely from her home office in Western Pennsylvania. And Dr. Laura Captari is a research and clinical psychologist at the Danielson Institute, working at the intersection of trauma and spirituality to promote healing and flourishing. So to get things started, I'll say welcome, and we look forward to these presentations coming up.
Hey, everybody. I appreciate the chance to be with you and talk about these important issues. As a team from the Danielson Institute, I'm going to just kick us off with a little overview of our program of work on preventing burnout and promoting flourishing among religious leaders. And we're also doing that with other helping professionals. And then Reverend Hydinger will get into some systematic lit review findings. And Dr. Captari will talk about an intervention project we have going that we're really excited about. So some of this work is funded by the Templeton Foundation and the Peel Foundation, which is supporting the intervention program, especially that is driving some of this emerging research. So the background for us, when I first came to the Danielson Institute, we happened to have a data set sitting around. I don't know if you've ever stumbled into a data set sitting around that proved to be really interesting, but it was about clergy from a particular religious denomination. And in that data set happened to be one of the leading clinical measures of trauma symptoms, among other measures. And as I was going through that, I was invited to look at it. I realized there was really an alarming prevalence rate of trauma symptoms at a clinical level. And as I started to calculate it up, it turned out that about 1/3 of the clergy in this denomination, now this is going back a number of years ago, over a decade ago, about 1/3 of the clergy were scoring themselves in trauma symptoms related to their ministry work within the PTSD range. And so a prevalence rate of about 1/3 is higher than post-deployment military personnel. So it was quite alarming that they had been invited to say a bit about the stressful circumstances that they were scoring their symptoms on. And so it gave us some sense of a range of different kinds of highly stressful situations. And I imagine for many of you, this won't come as any big shock, though it does for some people to think that clergy might be more, have a higher exposure rate to trauma than military personnel. But the key symptoms that was getting at in that assessment were intrusive thoughts, hyperarousal, avoidance, classic trauma-related symptoms that are on a continuum, but at a certain level can lead to some impairment, right? And so we started thinking more about trauma in these helping professions, which we think about as embodied existential dynamics of overwhelming levels of threat and anxiety, right? So the religious denomination that had commissioned that study would not let us publish those findings. They were concerned that that would be too alarming to the public, and it would not be helpful for recruiting more people into ministry. So we replicated the study with a more diverse sample of clergy and religious leaders from the Abrahamic faiths. This was still pre-COVID, really found almost the same level of trauma symptoms, very similar themes about what was proving highly stressful. And we published that in 2021. That was a study led by Libby Ruffing. During the pandemic, we've also been doing a lot of seminary student research on spiritual formation. That's a big part of our research program. And in collaboration with David Wang and a national project, we found sort of similar rates of trauma symptoms, mental health problems, burnout rates among seminary students during the pandemic, higher risk rates for students from marginalized and oppressed communities. We also were looking at resilience dynamics, which will feed into what we're going to talk about here in a minute. Resilience was, among seminary students, was tied to opportunities for reflection, meaning-making, processing complex emotions in healthy relational spaces. Some people would say that's all obvious. but it is the case that not all students were finding their way into those resources. So it did differentiate those who were finding places to do that work, and students who were not, and resilience was tied to being able to do that. All of this has shaped some of our current interest around prevention as well as intervention. We're doing research at Christian and Jewish seminaries, trying to understand what students early in their training know about some of the vulnerabilities they might be bringing into this work, and whether they're going to get a chance to work on that. We see many students do have some awareness of things like vulnerabilities towards perfectionism, egotism, isolation, rescuing, overfunctioning, some of these things we talk about even as they start seminary. And that sort of begs the question, are those the kinds of formative issues that they may get invited to work on or not? One of our colleagues, Eric Brown, is doing some research in this area, really his own program of research, but collaborating with us on several of these areas. Focused on Black clergy, and he also is doing work on Black therapists. He published this study about a week ago on adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and buffering resources among Black clergy and religious leaders. Found that Black clergy in a sample in the US scored higher in adverse child experiences that are risk factors for trauma than a matched national sample, suggesting that clergy might bring in some woundedness, some past suffering that, of course, drives the desire to make a difference in the world, but can also be risk factors for PTSD symptoms. Dr. Brown found that those trauma risks were moderated by forms of religious coping and congregational support. So that's some kind of partial good news for those clergy who were engaging in religious coping, formation, orientations that proved constructive, or who were getting good relational support from their congregations that buffered that risk. Obviously, I'm sure we all know how that can break the other way too, when people have sort of negative spirituality templates that drive other forms of coping in congregations that are not as supportive. And last thing I'll mention is, before turning to Kristen, is this national study of clergy, chaplains, and therapists that we're doing as part of this PEAL project. And shout out to Ben Odell that we got a chance to present some early findings on this in an event he hosted this last year at the Department of Health and Human Services. We've played with this data further since then, Ben, a little over 300 clergy, chaplains, and therapists. And the basic story here is the rates of suffering in these helping professions in this sample have pretty much doubled from our earlier research. So really staggering rates of reports of trauma symptoms, around 75% of the sample reporting trauma symptoms in the PTSD range, 82% reporting symptoms in the moderate to severe depression range. We all have had to run those numbers multiple times, look at them over and over again, actually to believe that's really the level of suffering that many of our folks on the front lines are having. There's a number of protective factors that we're listing here that, again, seem buffering, things like humility, self-compassion, supportive management or work environments, differentiation of self, work-family boundaries. So there are some angles that we can look into further, many of which probably some of you are doing as well, to see what can make a difference. And Kristen's going to note that the bulk of research in this area that we've found shows that there's very few intervention studies to see what can actually make a difference with this, and that's going to set up some of what we'll talk about in a minute. Kristen?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. To just continue on, I am going to highlight some of the themes about what we found in our systematic literature review. We did look at all published empirical articles that we could find full text of in English from around the world. And we have 5 different continents represented. A little over half are studies that were within the US. And it's also worth noting that on the whole, these within the US in particular were regional, not national samples, to sort of just give you the headline. There is not a lot of literature at a generalizable level at all around clergy well-being and burnout risks. And by regional, I mean like the United Methodist Conference of New York State, like regional to a state, sometimes regional to a city. And then as far as industry goes, out of these 82 studies, almost all of them are looking at clergy. We only had 12 studies looking at chaplains, and only, again, 2 of them were in the United States. It's largely Christian. It's largely of one Christian denomination. It's mostly reporting on male religious leaders. Only less than 4% of studies did something with 100% female participants, and none of those studies were in the United States. And then it's also mostly white identified religious leaders when reported. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, which means we have pieced together the themes and trends that we could find. But you'll see on these next couple of slides, there's asterisks next to a few of them. Steve, if you can move to the next one. So at all levels, we looked at like individual, relational, and systemic components. And some of these risk factors that you're seeing here probably are not surprising. One of my colleagues calls these like the duh findings, but just because they're not surprising doesn't mean they have to be inevitable. Tenure has an asterisk next to it because this was very much an example of some of the complexity within the literature. So for instance, some studies found the longer you were in your job, sort of the more seasoned you got and the less at risk you were. Whereas other studies were finding the younger you were sort of fresher and like maybe had more energy and not as likely to be scoring on some of our negative burnout and trauma measures. Some of these things at the individual level will be tied to personality traits, like some of the vulnerabilities Steve mentioned that we're looking at in seminary students, whether it's like people pleasing or over functioning or like having your self-worth tied to perceived success. At the relational level, we at the Danielson tend to operationalize spiritual struggles as a relational struggle. So like if you think about a connection to God, the divine, the universe, however that is operationalized, that falls under here too. So spiritual struggles work to family struggles, which again seems like a duh, as well as family to work, going both directions. In traditions. So many of our studies were within the United Methodist Church, which is itinerant. And so there were actually a good number of studies that looked at relocation stress on the clergy, and then sometimes also on clergy spouses. And then one article even had the phrase serving a traumatic church. This was something that was a qualitative finding, but that again, if the relational experience there is perceived as traumatic, maybe is a duh response. And then at the systemic level, probably not surprising, people are trying to like earn livings in many ways. And so if they aren't being adequately compensated to be able to do that, maybe they're having to hold down another job in addition to their religious leadership work. As many local clergy know, you can be in 1 hour of the day writing a sermon, in another hour of the day cleaning a bathroom, and another hour of the day putting up a social media post or doing something marketing oriented. Like all the multiple roles and sort of the blurring of where one role ends and one role begins is very overwhelming, as well as the fact that like when you're out in the community, every person you run into is a potential congregant, or is a congregant, or is a former congregant. And it can be very challenging to know when you quit being, or even just feel like you never can stop being a local pastor or a local rabbi or a local religious leader in some form or fashion. Now, for protective factors, there's a lot here. And what I want to emphasize is the studies that looked at protective factors looked at what helps reduce those scores of the burnout symptoms or trauma symptoms. So these mirror some of what our study that we presented to the Department of Health and Human Services already said. So I won't spend a ton of time since we've already looked at that. And I want to have time for the Q&A. I just do want to highlight things like mentoring, or again, the rooted spiritual engagement, the strong sense of relationship with the divine, which like takes space to be able to have and cultivate and spend time in. And then clear articulation of boundaries and feeling valued by your institution, whether that's a chaplain and feeling valued by the non-religious workers that you're working alongside, or whether that's a local congregant and feeling valued by the congregants sitting in your pew at every worship service. Can move to the next one. So these well-being enhancers were a very small subset of our literature review, because they're actually looking at what ties to positive outcomes, and there just aren't as many things looking at positive outcomes as opposed to negative outcomes. So some of these will overlap with the protective factors, but these were things found at a statistically significant level to correlate with positive outcomes, not just reduce the scores of negative outcomes. So there are some like what we call virtues in here, like gratitude or humility or self-compassion, the high levels of perspective taking, and goal orientation. Again, strong, secure relationships of a variety of levels. It was consistently coming up that it doesn't need to just be like a one person that you can turn to, but that support kind of needs to be felt both within your workplace, within your family unit, and then have something outside of those two things as much as possible. So we're going to move on to a quick time of Q&A. And the question for your group is just to consider what of those risk factors feels most like pressing or relevant or meaningful in your experience.
I believe we're going to hear from Laura next. Laura, we'll turn the presentation over to you.
Wonderful. Well, it's been great to be in the breakouts with you all. This is really fun to get to hear what's coming up in your context. I'm going to just continue building on what my team has shared so far. And specifically, we're excited to share with you all a little bit about a program we've been developing and are empirically testing that we're calling the CHRYSALIS program for helping professionals. So recognizing that almost nothing has been done in the literature to really empirically understand how to help people facing risk of burnout, compassion fatigue, traumatization. We were able to get grant funding to begin to develop and test such a program. So what is CHRYSALIS? We're using this metaphor from nature. We find it's a really powerful metaphor of the need for a space to be able to step back from the stress and busyness of providing care, ministering to others, to attend to ourselves, our own well-being, our own formation. And you'll see we found a way to make the acronym work there on the left. Oh, and let me go on here. So we're drawing from the latest research. Some of that Kristen has just given an overview about, looking at both occupational hazards like burnout, vicarious trauma, as well as moral injury, as well as we are drawing from positive psychology to really understand what can help people to thrive. That last slide that Kristen shared looking at well-being enhancers, we want to understand how to help religious leaders cultivate those things. And we have two formats of our current RCT. So we have a individual self-reflection, expressive writing format, and then a process-oriented online group. In this program, we're really calling for a paradigm shift from self-care to formation, really critiquing that, albeit well-intended, professional recommendations around self-care have pretty significant limitations. They focus on external behaviors They often aren't exploring internal poles, like our own psychology, things like idealizing our role as a religious leader, or maybe the pull to compulsively self-sacrifice ourselves, tendency toward perfectionism, things like that. Also, self-care, as it's often thought about and talked about, is pretty grounded in Eurocentric and individualistic understandings of personhood, kind of ignoring more communal or relational ways of thriving, of flourishing. And self-care tends to fail to account for the complexity of context and systems, and religious leaders are embedded in systems that are often pulling them to do more, to be more. Self-care can also ignore how a lot of workplaces, congregations can actually reinforce overfunctioning. You're praised, you're seen as a real hero if you set yourself aside and empty yourself. So we have seen that this language of self-care, encouraging religious leaders to take care of themselves, can actually compound their distress and burnout, because it can fuel internal attributions of failure. People can feel like, I'm the problem, something's wrong with me, as opposed to thinking more systemically about the context they're working in and the particularities of that. Also, with the shift of formation, the goal of just not being burnt out as a religious leader or traumatized, that's kind of a low bar for your career, for your calling. So we are calling the field to more nuanced and comprehensive frameworks that also orient us toward flourishing. So in the CHRYSALIS program, folks that are in this 8-week online program have opportunities to process the toll of their work in providing care to others, to develop and reflect on what spiritually embedded strengths or virtues might be relevant to them in their particular situation, to metabolize some of these impacts and build resilience. And then we have a real focus on the uniqueness of each person's intersectional identities, their life experiences, their core values, recognizing that there is going to be no one size fits all answer when it comes to addressing risk for burnout, because each of us is unique and the situations we are working in and providing care within are also quite unique. We also have a significant focus on thinking systemically and encouraging leaders to interrogate and resist pressures they might be facing that are counter to their well-being. So what you'll see here are 5 domains we move through within the 8-week program. And we're kind of shifting from encouraging people to do more of a particular thing to a more constructivist understanding, where we're inviting religious leaders to reflect on their own situation, context, and develop wisdom and discernment about what that might call for. So starting at the top left, we talk about processing capacities as those things that support us in holding complexity and metabolizing suffering. That could include a lot of different things. You'll see a couple examples there, including mourning, grief, perspective taking, developing flexibility, holding complexity, those things that help us to metabolize the suffering we witness and experience. We also talk in the program about relational capacities. So those are those virtues that keep us connected with our own humanness and that of others, ranging from humility to compassion, self-compassion, and the list could go on, right? This is not inclusive. We talk about vitalizing capacities as being pretty important in the face of burnout. Vitalizing meaning what helps catalyze your motivation, energy, and passion. What sparks joy, creativity, hope in the work you're doing. And then orienting capacities, really it captures what provides a sense of direction and clarity about why you're doing what you're doing. You'll see a few examples there. Curiosity being oriented by integrity, one's meaning, and so forth. So then finally, we invite folks in the CHRYSALIS program into a conversation about what we call agentic capacities. Might be a little bit of a weird way to use the word, but recognizing that often what can make something traumatic is feeling helpless and feeling like there's a loss of agency and a lack of autonomy. So inviting folks to reflect on what strengths they can draw from that can help fortify and strengthen them in the face of pressure, such as courage, healthy use of anger, and orientation toward justice, and things like that. So what have we found so far? Well, we have just submitted this for publication. This is with 41 religious leaders and other helping professionals who were in our group condition so far. And really exciting to be able to share with you that while we're still developing this, we have found significant reductions in people's sense of vicarious trauma symptoms and burnout, and that holds 2 months after they leave the program. We also found significant increases in a holistic sense of well-being and meaning in their work. As part of this, we also are gathering qualitative data. So I want to share just a bit about that with you so you can get a sense of the texture of what people are finding helpful. Because again, we're starting with the idea that there is no one size fits all answer or approach. It will be distinct based on each person's situation. So many people moving through this program name just how critical relational support and a sense of solidarity is, particularly with other colleagues, other religious leaders who get it, feeling witnessed, seen, like they can show up and be known as a whole person, not just as a religious leader. Having a dedicated time and space set aside to process and reflect. Most often religious leaders are holding space for others, so to have that space held for them seems pretty vital. And then many participants talked about growing in differentiation, being able to set boundaries and acknowledge their own limitations, which is resonant with humility, having an accurate understanding of themselves as well as what they cannot provide. People talk about emergence of new perspectives through the program, learning from others. So it seems like there's something about relational spaces where people can not only provide support, but kind of think together about new emergent possibilities. Less imposter feelings seem to come out of that as people have a sense of shared resonance and realize that other people are, struggling and navigating complex ministry situations. And then some people name changes in their approach to relationships, even after leaving the program, as well as changes in the way they engage with their work and ministry, feeling more grounded and present, advocating for systemic changes. And finally, we wanted to ask folks 2 months after they are wrapping up, 2 months after they leave this CHRYSALIS program, what strengths, virtues that we talked about seemed most relevant and helpful to them. And we found that really interestingly, all 5 of these areas are showing up in religious leaders' lives. So I included some direct quotes, and I won't read them all for the sake of time, but when it comes to relational capacities, someone said, "I'm now more accepting of the fact that I'm not God. There are many things I don't and will never know." So grappling with humility as it relates to ministry. With regard to orienting, what orients people, religious leaders are naming that, I recognize it's important for me, that what is important for me is not negated by the desires and expectations of my parish. So holding that orientation that also values the self. With regard to processing the exposure to suffering, someone shared that, I now have more space to sit in the suffering of others without, I notice that compulsion to problem solve or fix or rescue, and I can catch myself. And then with regard to vitalizing capacities, what is helping religious leaders stay present and access joy and passion? One person talked about, I spend more time now doing meaningful things rather than beating myself up about perceived failures. And then finally, when it comes to agency, religious leaders, and especially those who had less privilege, who may have oppressed or marginalized identities, are sharing things like, I now am doing a better job drawing from courage to speak up for myself and fair treatment in my work with greater intention. I don't apologize anymore about what is needed for my own health and well-being. So I think with that, we're going to move into a time of Q&A. So Ben, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Laura. Phenomenal. Really interesting to see those strategies and how everything's coming together. So quick reminder, make sure to drop your comments, questions in the chat feature. Raise your hand if you'd like to have a question as well, and jump into this conversation. I'm going to lead us off with a question here in a second, but yeah, just make sure you're dropping those questions in or raising your hand to jump into this conversation that we're going to start right now.
Ben, can I also just mention before we start, just to let people know, we're doing this project for the next 4 years. It's free if folks want to refer folks who might be interested in participating. It's in an ongoing basis of quarterly groups and folks in the individual conditions.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Steve, because we'll drop in the chat the link for yourself or anyone you're working with who's in a religious leadership or helping role. Please pass this information on to them, and we would love to welcome them in as a part of this program.
I will just say it is limited to U.S. participants. I know we've got some international participants on here, so I just want to mention that now.
Great call. I was wondering about geographic boundaries. So yeah, US is good to know. Well, there was one question that came in before the session, so I want to start us off with that. Are there any particular remedies or considerations for clergy of color, and do these remedies differ for clergy of color who pastor mostly majority Caucasian or white churches? So specifically challenges for or remedies, strategies for clergy of color, and then any consideration for clergy of color who may be pastoring a majority white culture or congregation different from them.
Let me engage that in 2 ways, and I'll invite Kristen to weigh in on what we know formally in the research literature, and let me just kind of talk as a practitioner and in my work as a diversity consultant. I mean, I think that we really don't know enough in the research to answer that in a really highly intelligent way. But clearly, folks of color, folks from marginalized communities are going to need spaces of connection with folks that share those experiences. And I think that also Dr. Brown's research points to some other dynamics as he's charting out both Black therapists and Black clergy. To note, his work, especially with Black therapists, highlights groups of other Black therapists who can connect, who get it. His clergy findings kind of speak more to the relational environment of the congregation itself. But I would expect that relational community is huge, and that we also need to know more in the research because there isn't a very diverse portfolio of research, right, Kristen?
Yeah, if you'll remember when I was showing what the overall themes were, it was a mostly white male Christian perspective. And we had literally one study of our 82 that even investigated race, and it did find that non-white clergy members were at higher risks for negative outcomes, but that's one. There's also an understanding, like hesitation on many in communities of color around participating in research. Like there's not been the greatest history around that too. But I do think thinking about the well-being enhancers and how many of those are relational, that just to echo what Steve was saying, I think understandable, like-minded or similar looking identity groups could be very helpful.
Well, and let me mention also, I'll just put in a plug, which you'll hear about again before we end, but the next common table conversation that we're going to have is around the topic of multicultural ministry and how to go about doing that. We actually have our speaker for that, who's Peter Denio. He's going to be the one who will speak next month. But so just a plug that if you're interested in this particular topic, just hold tight, because next month we're going to be diving into some hopefully helpful resources.
And if I can add one thing to that, the way that we're engaging with religious leaders and helping professionals within this model we're putting forward of thinking about the nuance of each person's social location, intersectional identities, areas of oppression, invite a discussion around what virtues might actually help promote flourishing for them. Of course, there are larger systemic things that they're contending with that need to be changed, and the literature talks about that as burden virtues sometimes, like virtues that people take on that support their survival but not necessarily flourishing. But one of the things we're really excited about that shows up in our findings so far with this CHRYSALIS framework is that it lends itself well to multicultural context, because we're asking folks about the strengths, the capacities that are there that they need to draw from. So it may be that someone who is experiencing oppression needs to draw from a combination of courage and hope and passion and perspective taking, right? And that's some of the complexity we're trying to weave in to build on conversations about self-care.
Before we jump to our first question, Dr. Sandage, if I remember correctly, in that seminary study, there's also a note that there are more risks for seminarians from communities of color.
That's right. Yeah, in that longitudinal study during COVID, high rates of suffering and struggle for all students, but higher for students of color and sexual minority students.
Yes, and so there too, like even not thinking about clergy, but clergy in training.
In the training period.
In the
That's
training
right.
process,
Yeah.
or identifying, coming into serving with some of those boundaries.
And our colleague Nicolette Manglos-Weber has done really good qualitative research in that same project with seminary students, noting that the hospitality of the seminary environment towards those diversity issues can differ markedly and makes a huge difference in how all that goes, right? So it's about the environment that is supporting or not supporting folks.
Excellent. Let's jump over to William. William, I saw your hand raised. If you want to come off mute and jump in, ask a question, we'd love to hear it. There you go. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, as you have participants who come into your cohort or your program, how do you establish or assess a baseline of where they are and measure progress for them?
Laura, you want to take that?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking, William. So when folks come in, we do an initial orientation meeting with each person. And then we gather data right now as part of the randomized control trial at 4 time points. So at baseline, meaning before they enter the individual or group program format, we gather that same information, qualitative and quantitative, halfway through the program, at the program's conclusion, and then 2 months later.
Across a variety of measures.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Have you created your own assessment tool, or these are to be able to measure these things? That's what I was more trying to find out.
Okay.
Do you use something off the shelf? Have you created an assessment tool that guides you through this?
Great question. So we're drawing from self-report measures of burnout, various symptom measures. But some of what I showed as far as the different areas of virtue development, there are not measures developed for each of those yet. So we're drawing on qualitative data in that, asking people to describe any changes they've experienced and how it's impacting their life.
But the burnout, vicarious trauma, holistic eudaimonic flourishing, those are all, we're using validated measures from the research literature for pretty much all of that, along with the qualitative open-ended questions. So.
Awesome. I see a hand raised by Charlie, I believe. If you want to come off mute, there you go. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question. Do you ask ahead of time if they've ever done any kind of retreat, other forms of self-care, or is this the first time they participated in something? We ran a retreat for 13 years for pastors, found some similar results, not in the language you used, but a lot of them never had been to any kind of a retreat or had been confronted with the idea of self-care or formation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do ask as part of the individual orientation meeting to get a sense of what resources, supports people are drawing from, what's available to them already, and then we try to track that over time as they're moving through, recognizing that, you know, this is time limited. We hope that it gives people who haven't experienced something like this before, maybe a different framework for engaging relationally, because people are telling us, and we really feel that like people need long-term spaces to be able to, you know, continue to talk, to process, to be together, to support one another.
Part of why we're excited about getting to know you all in this network and some other related networks is because we do want to create resources that participants can draw on beyond this program and realize that that's going to be necessary for the long haul. So the randomized controlled trial helps us really test the effects of this particular program, but we want to connect people to other options for the full length of their careers, which is going to take a lot more than this.
Thanks, Charlie. As we're getting close to here on time, I wanted to jump in and offer one more question. We'll see if we have time for more. As we focused and talked about the need for intervention and this strategy for intervention, I think there's an opportunity for us to think about, should we focus on, well, let me say, all interventions would reduce risk factors and increase protective factors. But as the research and the work you all are doing, it seems like it's about increasing some more of those protective factors, less so about reducing the risk factors, at least in the CHRYSALIS strategy. So is the opportunity here for us to focus more on the protective factors? Like if we had to define, if others were to explore, define an intervention, is the opportunity to focus on one or the other based on the literature that you all are building on?
I think the way we're positioning what we're doing is in with a trend in the mental health field towards a dual factor approach to mental health, which recognizes that suffering and well-being or flourishing are not direct opposites. They're actually somewhat distinct factors. So we actually really like the idea of trying to reduce the negative, reduce burnout, reduce vicarious trauma, and also try to increase the positive, meaning well-being and flourishing. And those are often only moderately correlated. So I guess, our answer is going to be, we think both of those are important. And why just focus on one? Different people may need a little different relative emphasis, but we're rolling with the idea of working both angles right now until we get talked out of it.
Let me see if Betsy's able to come and share her question. Come on camera or come off mute, Betsy.
Hi, thank you. My question is a little bit of a follow-up, I think, to the one that Ben asked, which has to do with the role of the congregation or the institution in supporting clergy flourishing and well-being, particularly as you talked about wanting to look at both elements, right? Both I can't remember the language that you use, but right,
suffering and flourishing.
Correct. So here I'm going to use the suffering language, right? And particularly when and I share that concern about the language of self-care, right, which ignores the system and puts it simply on the clergy person, and yet what is the role, or how do we partner with the institutions to help them see and understand and be part of this work? And I don't know whether that's within the brief of what you're thinking about and working on, but I'm interested in any thoughts that you have.
I just had one thing from the literature around that, is that on my well-being slide, paid leaves and sabbaticals had an asterisk next to it because it wasn't offering it that yielded improved outcomes. It was actually taking it. So the institution, the denomination, and the congregation need to not just offer it, but encourage and support their religious leaders to take advantage of that as well, which it doesn't always happen. That's one tangible example.
Yeah, Betsy, I think you're raising such important points at a systemic level. I mean, we're trying to have conversations with leaders of certain denominational groups, and I know many of you are working in those spaces as well, to kind of frame the understanding of what's needed to cultivate healthy formation, well-being, and maturity among leaders over time. And certainly some congregation-oriented settings, it's more up to the congregational level. But we do think there's a lot more conversation needed about healthy theological perspectives about who leaders are, what it takes to lead, and to kind of be able to push back against dangerous or unrealistic expectations. We're also concerned that there are settings increasingly where it's not even just the neglect of the leader's well-being, but in our research, we're seeing really concerning levels of relational and sometimes even physical aggression against faith leaders, which I think is probably increased given our polarization and tensions as a society. So I do think there's a lot more thinking needed. And again, I'm sure some of you are working on this about how to shape the more systemic understandings of congregations and denominational leaders about what is actually a healthy model of who leaders are as persons.
I was just going to say, I would just add to that, we talk in the CHRYSALIS program about interrogating and resisting systemic pressures, but at a denominational organizational level, we have the opportunity to change those systemic pressures, to really interrogate, like, how do we get to ourselves to a place that the leader of a religious community is supposed to be flawless, have unbounded energy, and be able to help everyone at every moment of the day. Like, that is actually a wonderful fantasy, but it's not possible. Actually, we're seeing that bear out among religious leaders in our research who are saying, I love this work, but it's killing me. So I think there's something about interrogating and changing what congregations and systems expect of these leaders.
Just a dramatic example, but just quickly, years ago, I had a really painful case of a young worship leader of a church who was referred to me for therapy. He had had an affair, had sex with a congregant in the basement of his church. And this in no way justified his acting out or that action. But in the bigger picture, it was concerning to find out that the previous 2 years he'd been called back from vacation early by the congregation because they just didn't enjoy worship with him on vacation. So that was not the whole reason he was acting out, but it was kind of the systemic context of the objectification of the leader and the dependence that I think in that case eventually resulted in some implosion, right? So dramatic example, but I'm sure we've all seen various levels of that kind of a problem.
Yeah, so I think what I'm seeing and hearing in the conversations is appreciation of both the individual, relational, and systemic. And I think we can think not only about interventions, mitigating suffering and increasing flourishing, but we can also think about interventions that have impacts at all those levels as well, right? And think about strategies that we can do to improve those. Let me say, I appreciate all the links in the chat. I don't know about you all, but my window count has increased during this webinar as I pull up things that I'm going to read as follow-up from this event. While we're waiting for any questions to come in, let me say that I haven't heard a lot of language around resilience. So are there ways or things around the term or efforts around resilience that are part of what you all are seeing in this literature, research, or intervention?
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that, because we certainly talk about resilience a good bit in CHRYSALIS, but we talk about it more as an outcome than an inherent trait. Resilience is defined different ways in the literature, but we've found that especially when working with people who hold marginalized identities, this language of resilience can be oppressive to them. If it's like, oh, you just need to work on becoming more resilient, that is more of an individual problem where I need to develop this, internal thing, as opposed to asking, how do we create communities in which religious leaders can thrive? So we think about resilience as a trajectory that even in the face of stress that's inherent in being a clergy person, they can still thrive.
That burnout in seminary study, Ben, that I cited, led by Peter Jankowski and Dave Wang was involved in that. We did look at resilience as a trajectory, like Laura is saying, among students who actually were struggling spiritually, had high spiritual struggles, and followed their trajectory and wanted to see what seemed to interrupt a really negative trajectory and sort of stabilize. And that's the study that showed it's having these relational spaces for connection, processing complex emotions, wrestling with the meaning I'm making. Students who seem to have access to that kind of experience had a better chance of this resilience trajectory. Now that, as Laura's saying, that's a kind of a relational space that systems like seminaries may or may not provide. And it's up to students sometimes, obviously, to make access of those. But that was one study looking at resilience over time, which is really a longitudinal question, methodologically, what changes a pattern that's headed in a negative direction.
That's a great point. You all made me think about Michelle's comment about kind of multiculturalism, right? Because sometimes multiculturalism and openness to multiple cultures can actually be about integrationism of just the existing culture. I know, just be like everyone else, kind of jump online, right? And I think what I heard in CHRYSALIS as well was like both an acknowledgement and in some of the factors as far as like not being hyper individualistic, not being, and really being open to the different ways and the intersectional ways that some of these pieces come together. So,
well, we're actually even finding that cultural humility, which involves that kind of openness, is looking like a protective factor for both in some of our student research and our religious leader research, and even with mental health clients in our clinic. So there's it's often not identified as something that might be conducive to well-being or growth, more of a social justice consideration, which we would also affirm. But there actually might be something about this kind of openness to cultural differences that's actually good for our well-being.
That's super interesting. And I think like it's interesting to contrast resilience to humility, right? And both resilience as a journey and humility as a trait, where I think sometimes we flipped it, right? And sometimes thought that, oh, we're going to treat humility as a journey, which it is too, or it can be for many. But then resilience not as something that we're expecting, but working toward. So amazing. And let me say thanks to everybody for jumping in with the comments and the chat. It's been great to see that, and I think there's some richness in those too. Reverend Harris says some cultures also have better approaches to dealing with stressors, right? And so learning and being appreciative of multiple cultures can be helpful as well.